Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nina and Sabina, for inviting me to speak as part of this wonderful series. I was just sharing with Sarah and Rosalba that I had a major fangirl moment when I first found out that I would be speaking alongside them and in the same series as Heidi Mirza and Maria Domar Pereira. What an honor. I'm both nervous and excited as I speak to you all today on a topic that I'm incredibly passionate about. Decolonizing feminist teaching and intersectionality as critical pedagogy. My talk today is based primarily on a paper that I wrote as part of the UGC UCURI funded project, Teaching Feminisms, Transforming Lives. This was a 3-year North-South collaboration between the University of Edinburgh, UK, and Ambedkar University, Delhi, India. And simply put, our project was about the successes, the challenges, the continuities and disjunctures that feminists encounter in the academy, interrogated and analyzed based on our own experiences and articulated in our own words. It culminated in an edited collection titled Doing Feminisms in the Academy. This was published by Zuban, an imprint of Kali for Women, which is India's first feminist publishing house. So in this talk, I'll critically examine how white privilege and northern hegemony in knowledge production play out in contemporary feminist classrooms. I'll primarily be drawing on my own experiences to talk about this, and also engage with the question, what are the pedagogical challenges of engaging with questions of difference in these classrooms? What can intersectionality as critical pedagogy offer specifically when it comes to decolonizing these classrooms? What politics of emotions do the teacher and the students navigate in this process of decolonizing? And broadly speaking, how do global neoliberal logics affect this process? So this is the whole set of questions, and I hope that I'll be able to touch upon some of this material in my talk today. So you could say that taking cue from Claire Hemmings, this talk is a reflexive account of the stories I've heard and the stories I tell and how I tell them in the feminist classrooms that I'm a part of. But before I delve into these stories, a few words about my approach to this paper and my sense of location in the academy. Now, when I first started writing down my reflections for this autoethnographic account, I really struggled to articulate my ideas, my thoughts. I found it easier to write in verse. So what you'll see on the screen are the verses I wrote before I could articulate my observations in a scholarly manner. And this too is in a small way my trying to resist the conventional Western norms of scholarship that have come to dominate the world over. I joined the University of Edinburgh in 2012. And doing so really challenged my sense of location and my subjectivity in the academy in ways that I hadn't known before. I became acutely aware of how my body was positioned as brown, as South Asian, of color. Like I didn't even know the term BAME or BME then. As a university student in Paris and later Cambridge, it hadn't mattered so much. Finding solidarity with fellow students from the global south and doing the mental gymnastics of swapping us and them when the professors would say we in this part of the world, for me to say no, they in this part of the world, and so on. It had been frustrating, but it had somehow been enough at the time. But in my role as a faculty member, often being the only person of color and the only person from the global south at departmental meetings and in practically all the classes that I taught, was rather unsettling. But perhaps what was most unsettling was the realization of marginalization when I had mostly known privilege up until then. Although I had known caste-based discrimination in my childhood in India, I come from a mixed caste union and had faced some racial discrimination. I had had a considerably privileged upbringing, and the same social privileges and cultural capital accompanied me when I started my career as a lecturer in gender studies at Ambedkar University, Delhi, India. I have to admit, being the only woman academic of color from the South in the classrooms in which I taught at Edinburgh has had a profound impact on me. It has changed the vantage point from which I teach. It has transformed the ways in which I understand knowledge. And it has led me to an appreciation of the need to decolonize what counts as knowledge. Among other things, I understand decolonizing as being about the politics of location, including my own. It has led me to confront dilemmas about my subjectivity, about inserting myself in the classroom space, about including myself and people like me in the discourse. And as one of the few, if not the only obvious visible others in my own classroom, decolonizing the classroom space is then not an option for me, but a necessity, a requirement. Now, I want to begin with a story about the history of feminism to highlight the need for decolonizing feminist teaching. This is a story that I'm sure we are all familiar with. The waves metaphor, which has remained the model of choice for teaching the history of feminism in women's and gender studies courses in both the global north as well as the global south. While the metaphor helps shed light on some very important feminist struggles, an intersectional lens reveals that this approach is nonetheless exclusionary. It has mostly enabled middle-class white Western women's political agendas to stand in for feminism more generally. Now, to be fair, the waves metaphor is employed in the feminist classroom today with theoretical critiques by Black and post-colonial feminists added on. But what this implies is that feminism is always already constructed as Euro-American and predominantly white in origin and development. Now, in my experience as pedagogical strategy, informs in broadly two ways the student perceptions at the level of the classroom. The more politically conscious students see the strategy for what it is and often observe in the course evaluations that even though the content about women of color and third world women was added on reasonably early on in the course, it wasn't adequately stirred, if you like, in the course. But I suspect that the majority of students continue to receive this add and stir model as communicating the contours and the particularities of the knowledge field. And as a result, the model ends up informing the students' expectations and epistemological outlooks regarding what constitutes what is central or core and what is marginal or on the periphery in terms of feminist knowledge. So it signals to the students as to who deserves to be part of feminism, what constitutes feminist knowledge, and contributes to what Spivak has denounced as, in a sense, epistemic violence. Now, I recall teaching the history of feminism using the waves metaphor back in Delhi when I started my career, and later seeing it being used at Edinburgh and feeling deeply dissatisfied by it. For my students in Delhi, the intellectual and the geopolitical distance they needed to travel to access and relate to this metaphor had been far greater than for my students at Edinburgh. Now, some years ago, I came across Heidi Mirza's 2009 piece, which she has later developed as well, in which she narrated how excited she had been at having stumbled upon a photograph, and you see that on the screen, at the Museum of London of Indian women participating in a rally organized by British suffragettes. Like her, I too had never known that women like us had been part of the suffragette movement. So imagine how much more relatable the waves metaphor would have been for my students in Delhi had I been able to narrate to them the story about the Indian women's participation in a movement that had been largely written and recounted as a white women's movement. Sumita Mukherjee notes in her 2017 blog and later also in her 2018 book that these women had been there to demand neither their right to vote in Britain nor their right to vote in India, but to represent the size and the expanse of the British Empire. So that's interesting. Another interesting fact is that to commemorate 100 years of women's right to vote in the UK, the Royal Mail released in 2018 a stamp with Indian suffragette Sophia Talib Singh, whose photo and the stamp you see on the screen there. The second story that I want to share with you has to do with the production and circulation of knowledge in gender and development as a pedagogical site. The breadth of scholarship now available about gender politics in the global south and the critiques by modern Black and post-colonial feminists have meant that there is no doubt a strong awareness that teaching about third world women in singular, homogeneous terms, in disempowered terms, is problematic. You're likely to find Chandra Talpade Mohanty's Under Western Eyes as a prescribed reading on practically every gender and development course. However, these courses continue to mirror the field's ongoing inability to train the developmental gaze anywhere else but southward. Equally, they mirror the field's problematic relationship with neoliberalism. To be precise, the second story that I want to share with you is less a story and more an interrogation of a teaching aid in telling the stories that we tell in gender and development. Back in the 1990s, the use of case studies was being advocated to promote an appreciation for the diversity of Southern women. Today, they have become a mainstay in the pedagogical toolkit of gender and development teachers. And the Southern woman of these case studies has an assured sort of pre-packaged, what Rowley calls a pre-packaged presence in the classroom. Now, let me clarify. I don't take issue with the use of case studies per se. I use them myself as a pedagogical tool. I do fear that they may perpetuate among our students, even if inadvertently, an understanding of development as a problem of underdevelopment, largely housed in the global South. And they may also uncritically reflect the increasing shift to project-driven approaches where women are being empowered to solve their own problems, like Rowley says, and you can see the quote on the screen, and making these problems and the solutions then more accessible for sort of classroom analysis, if you like. And the way they're framed also perpetuates the notion of societies in the global South strictly adhering to a heteronormative and gender normativity and gender binary, whereas many would say that both of these were originally colonial imports. So such framing of case studies and representation of women and societies in the global South therein, in those case studies, problematically signals to our students that the need for world's global experts or gender experts, global gender experts, really comes from the global North. Typically, you'd find this also at gender and development conferences, but I won't go into that. What I will argue is that until Northern gender and development academics turn their gaze at themselves, until gender and development also becomes about understanding developmental challenges in their own backyard, and until people like me, so post-colonial feminist insider-outsiders, challenge the structures of hegemony from our marginal yet privileged locations, will not be able to empower our students with the comparative and the decolonial lenses required to bridge the chasm between the us and the them, and to see the third world women as anything other than worlds apart from what is known and familiar to most of our students in the global North. Now, an important issue to guard against in this regard is actually turning our own, I think is also turning our own students from the global South into case studies. Now, what do I mean by this? A key question I ask myself when teaching gender and development is whether my students from African countries, from Asian countries, from Latin American countries, and at the postgraduate level, actually there are at least a handful from these majority world contexts each year, whether these students, especially those who are of color, feel included in my classroom. How can I teach in a manner that is self-affirmatory for them and others like them who may be visibly different from the white Western majority in my class? How do I invite those students of mine who are from these Southern contexts to share their insights on these contexts without putting them in a spot, without turning them into a case study? Now, having been asked to explain the caste system in India over and over again in practically every class I attended at Sciences Po as a graduate student, I'm all too aware of what it feels like to be treated as a case study. Well, so it's important to teach in a manner that recognizes difference. I think it's equally important not to exceptionalize it. And I know that I can't do this work alone. I need my students. And here I look to my students to become my allies. I tell them early on that we need to work together to co-construct an inclusive classroom. I want to now share with you my reflections on actualizing intersectionality as critical pedagogy to address some of these issues and to also see how that inclusive classroom can be co-constructed by my students and I. Let me say a little bit about intersectionality. I'm mindful of how intersectionality has become a buzzword today and has been co-opted and depoliticized by the neoliberal regime in higher education. But in its original radical form, intersectionality was conceived as a mechanism, as we know, for understanding that gender doesn't exist in isolation from race, caste, class, religion, sexuality, and so on. And these identities are multiple and intersecting, and therefore the resultant power and privilege and inequalities and exclusion too cannot be understood and addressed through single axis frameworks. Intersectional pedagogy takes cognizance of this in terms of both the planned and the transacted curriculum. Now, I learned early on in my experience of teaching at Edinburgh that if I wanted my students to truly understand and engage with the intersectionality of identities and structures and how these produce marginality and oppression without thinking that these things only happen out there in the global South, and I couldn't actually begin there with the stories about the global South, but I would actually have to begin in the here and now. With us reflecting on our intersectional privilege, theirs and mine. And one of the ways in which I do this is to conduct a privilege walk. I know that I don't have enough time to get into details of this just now, but let it suffice to say that this activity acts as an important first step in what Spivak and Davis refer as the uncoercive rearrangement of the learning desires of the classroom. It signals to the students that reflexivity is important in our classroom, that it is an important step in the decolonizing project too. Centering the voices, perspectives, people's movements, and scholarship from the majority world, as Avino Okech reminds us, is yet another step in decolonizing the feminist classroom. Now, this cannot be done merely by adding non-Eurocentric scholars to the reading list. Enabling our students to relate to the stories from the majority world matters. You see, our students are often surprised and uncomfortable when the women in the mirror of course materials does not duplicate their own identity formations and other women seem to be in charge. I argue that this is often because most of our students know only to read what is addressed to them. So when the course materials push the students towards a decentering of their subjectivity, they must be helped to recognize how their self cannot be known solely on its own terms, that it is always already entangled with the other. Now, let me give you an example of how I try to do this in an advanced undergraduate course that I teach at Edinburgh. After a session on questions of race, caste, and ethnocentrism, I asked the students to imagine and write up the conversation that Black feminist activist Bell Hooks and Dalit feminist activist, scholar activist Annie Namala might have had were they to have met. In this exercise, the mirror of the course material the students must draw on emits a gaze of otherness, if you like, looking back, so to speak, in ways that alter the schemes of recognition. So students are being asked to authoritatively write up a conversation that is meant to look at them specifically as racialized white identities. This is a predominantly white classroom, in a manner that challenges their own self-perception. I try to enable them to reassemble their identity as purveyors of knowledge, albeit not in the traditional sense, but by indicating to them that they are the authors of this imagined conversation. They can ask of Hooks and Namala whatever questions they like and decide on howsoever these scholar activists might respond. This activity, a version of this activity also features as an assessment on the course. Now, the assessment is a big thing. Even if only half a dozen students attempt this essay question, the fact that it is an option, an assessment option, signals to the entire class that this learning is, and I hope that this learning is valued, that it is considered worthy of being tested. Employing intersectional pedagogy or intersectionality as critical pedagogy in this way is not without its emotional challenges. And this brings me to the reflection that even as I hold on to the ground rules of confidentiality, respect, listening to each other, expressing our thoughts and feelings freely, but constructively, I find myself less and less convinced by the foundational feminist practice of the safe classrooms, of creating safe classrooms, that these rules have their roots in. The safe classroom is one where no one is supposed to feel threatened. But over the years, I've found myself moving away from that and towards what some have called the contested classroom, or what others have called the transformative classroom. And my understanding of such a classroom is one which recognizes that we do not leave our embodied intersectionalities at the door of the classroom. The same social norms, structures, and processes that confer power and privilege upon individuals outside differentially, so outside of the classroom, also operate within the classroom. So our classroom is in this sense not a safe space and cannot really be a community of equals. It is instead a space of discomfort and hopefully transformation in which the students and I recognize and begin to unlearn our privilege and examine how this and our relative marginality are embedded in unequal structures of coloniality. And that brings me really to a few points, a few observations by way of conclusion. I want to say that as a feminist academic of color from the Global South, I have been thinking about these concerns for some years now. But just because I am brown or from the majority world does not mean that I'm disembedded from the colonial enterprise. I too am a product of a system of knowledge, of education that is predominantly Western. So I try to think of decolonizing classrooms and democratizing the curriculum as a journey rather than a destination, as a process rather than an outcome, ideas which have been very beautifully expressed by Muna Abdi. There are several blind spots, several dilemmas that I still need to interrogate, others that I'm in the process of addressing. So it's a work in progress. But doing this work can be quite exhausting and often borne by, this is the kind of work that's often done by the invisible, and involves the invisible labor of women of color, of staff from the Global South in the neoliberal university. So this leads me to argue that our labor towards decolonizing feminist teaching must be recognized, and decolonial praxis must be embraced by my white feminist colleagues and the institution itself. The onus really has to be on all involved. Only then the project of decentering whiteness and disrupting Northern hegemony in knowledge production can become scalable, whilst keeping in mind the danger of neoliberal co-option. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Sabina and Nina, for this invitation. And I think Rosalba and I are very grateful also to share this space with Radhika. I mean, it's a very difficult act to follow. You have already given us many amazing new ideas that I'm sure Rosalba and I would both want to respond to. And at the same time, you have picked up on some points that really resonate with our own thinking. As was already explained by Sabina, Rosalba and I will be engaging in a feminist dialogue, and I will say a little bit more about that. Then Rosalba will also speak about kind of our position of enunciation, where are we coming from? And then we will start with the 3 questions that were just outlined. We're of course really sad that Olivia cannot join us today, but we're hoping that we're kind of channeling her spirit, because of course many of our ideas and thoughts are also based on the ongoing conversations we have with her and the conversation that led to the book that we published indeed a few years ago. So let me just say something about feminist praxis and why we engage in a dialogue. Then I hand over to Rosalba, who will say something about our position of enunciation. And then Rosalba will pick up on the first question, whether it is possible to create radical and alternative spaces within neoliberal academia. I will respond, then we go to the next question and to the final question. So why are we engaging in a dialogue today? I mean, firstly, on a very personal note, I'm incredibly grateful for this space today, because my current research brings me into a masculine and military space, because I'm working on the way in which Afghan local interpreters have been treated as bodies that can be used and then disposed by Western international forces. So I'm engaging in a lot of spaces that are quite hostile. So I'm really grateful for this kind of generative space here today. But in a more common spirit, I think what's important to say is that my relation with Rosalba, of course, also started as a dialogue. So the first time we started working together was when I knew she was very much engaged. We have common friends. I know she was very much engaged in the student struggles, supporting the student struggles in the Netherlands, also based on her own knowledge of student struggles in the Global South that have been at the forefront, of course, and have taken the lead in inspiring student movements in the Global North. And she was working in the Netherlands, and at the time I was still an editor of the Dutch Journal of Gender Studies. And we were really both very interested and inspired by the fact that some of the students of that student struggle in Amsterdam were saying that it wasn't possible to have any democratization of higher education without decolonization. I know Rosalba was very touched also when she saw that banner, and I felt, I'd been working in a feminist archive before, I felt it was really important for the Dutch Journal of Gender Study to recognize that student struggle as part of our history and archive. So I invited her to co-edit a special issue, which is when our collaboration started. And then that later continued when we collaborated on the book. As some of you have seen the book, see in the introduction, that conversation has been ongoing. And I think what we try to reflect here is also that working and thinking is of course always collaborative, unlike what neoliberal academia perhaps represents, where often, you know, we have to push ourselves forward, we have to say what our personal contribution has been. In some cases we are even forced, when we put forward promotion cases, to say exactly the percentage that we contributed to a specific article. But of course none of our thinking is an individual enterprise. We think in dialogue with our foremothers and forefathers, and we think in dialogue with those people around us. And so again, today we want to kind of do this in praxis. We're also really keen, of course, to continue that dialogue with Radhika in a moment. The final thing I want to say about this is that the idea of this dialogue is important for us because, in the way that Radhika was saying, that this is a journey, it's not an endpoint. Of course, it's very difficult to find definitive answers. What we are trying to do is to have explorations. And again, this is something we think can be better done in dialogue. So I hand over to Rosalba, who can say something about positionality.
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you everybody for inviting me to be here with you today. Yeah, in that spirit of a dialogue, and I think that Radhika, you have already shared with us so much, but when we were preparing this presentation or this collaboration together, I was very, for me, it was very important to be clear about where we were speaking from. And your presentation is already doing in practice what we are supposed to be saying today. So that's what I'm very grateful that you were first. But the way I want to position ourselves in this dialogue that we are starting here is with a question. And the question is one that I constantly repeat. And I will repeat it until it becomes something that is actually, that feels so, I don't want to say natural, but that feels something that we cannot do with in every encounter or conversation that we have. And it's a question, where are we positioned to start our critique against the neoliberal higher education system? As feminists, where do we start to tell our stories of critique and resistance against neoliberalism and higher education? As decolonial feminists, we choose to echo the words of Sarah Mota, a friend of ours and also contributor in the book, in her critique towards leftist progressive perspectives on the neoliberal university and the system of higher education in global north settings. And Sarah Mota reminds us that by situating the verb of the university in the highly contested golden age means that as an institution, it is implicated in the history of accumulation, capitalism, dehumanization, and dispossession. And this implication means that the system of higher education is complicit with regimes of accumulation, regimes of whiteness, and regimes of non-being. However, the university came to be known as a space of morality and goodness, so we're supposed to defend it. But for us, our point of departure is actually to stop denying that the universities have an historical origin that was a consequence of the expansion of the European modernizing project, like nation states and the capitalist system. As decolonial feminists, we are articulating how this origin has been constantly covered up by normative claims of higher education as a positive common good. And in the rest of the conversation with this Sarah de Jong, I will come back to this point, but this is for us something that we don't want to constantly deny. This is the origin of the institutions where we are now working and trying to transform. Now, in the preparation of this presentation, we came to realize that we are very interested in, nonetheless, these conditions of possibility of transformation. Can we actually create radical alternative spaces within this modern colonial institution that we call universities and in general higher education? And I also going to repeat some of the things that, not to repeat, I'm going to connect with some of the things that Radhika has been already mentioned, and I'm sure that Sarah will take it up from there. But for me, it's very important to establish that as a women of color academic based in Western Europe, when we think about radical and alternative spaces, I'm very much concerned with coalitional politics. And these coalitional politics are not only with other feminists, but with many women who struggle and that are not calling themselves feminists, but that nonetheless are struggling for life-affirming practices in their own contexts and settings. And most of the cases, but not all the cases, but most of the cases in the margins or marginalized by universities and outside universities. But as Sarah was mentioning, in addressing this question of can we really create these radical alternative spaces, I have had the privilege of conducting research. And this research was because I was appointed by students of color who were concerned about the lack of demographic and epistemic diversity within the University of Amsterdam, which is one of the most, if not the most, but one of the oldest universities in the Netherlands and perhaps in Europe. And we were very concerned when we were appointed that this possibility, this open possibility for radical questioning of this white institution was open because of the decades of anti-racist activism within universities by mainly Black feminists and women of color, particularly Professor Gloria Becker, who was chair of this research at the University of Amsterdam. But this research was also possible, research as a radical opportunity and a radical possibility of transformation, because of the courageous mobilizations of the students that Sarah was referring to, who managed to transform their main demand of no democratization without decolonization into a concrete demand for interventions informed by research, led by a Black feminist. And as a contributor there, the way I work, the way I plan my research, the way I engage with the students was definitely inspired by my long-term coalitional work with First Nation peoples here in Abya or in the Americas, and their horizon of autonomy and self-determination that include the Land University, the Earth University, but also the pluriversities in the south of Mexico, created by and for First Nations peoples, and as a form of autonomy from a state. So the horizon that has transpired not only in this research, but in my collaborations with Sarah, with Olivia, in all the work that we have been doing together, are these local calls to defend autonomy, that understands that local calls in Europe to defend state-funded universities are of course important and are of course relevant, but are not, let's say, not sufficient to understand the present calls for decolonization in many other places, in many other realities that don't have the state as the horizon of political engagement. And this is one of the main, let's say, points that we were constantly talking about when we were engaging in, for example, editing this book. We need to bring this different, or this plurality of horizons of resistance and politicization when we are engaging with teaching as feminists in the classroom. And yeah, I don't know if you remember that conversation, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Rosalba. I think my answer to that question also oscillates a little bit between the kind of pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. So sometimes I feel pessimistic and sometimes hopeful. So I guess I want to share both at the moment. I mean, I teach a politics of post-colonialism module at the University of York that does normally, that I mean, has really given me incredible hope, even in this pandemic year. And I will return to that later. But there are also moments where I feel very pessimistic, which is when the module ends and I have to put a number on the learning of the students. And in the UK, we work with a grading scale up to 100, but it's pretty much impossible to obtain a 100. And there's incredible pressure on students nowadays to obtain certain grades because otherwise their degree is pretty much seen as useless. If they don't obtain the famous 2-1, they will be excluded from graduate employment schemes, etc. And so I have had situations where it is very clear to me that students have learned so much and opened themselves up to new perspectives in such modules. But if that is not reflected in the particular grade I have to give on their essays according to a very, very, very rigid set of criteria, then I also understand that I'm sending those students into a kind of neoliberal labor market, which they meet with incredible anxiety, again, also given, you know, austerity politics in the UK, given the impact of the pandemic on labor opportunities in the first place. And so there are moments when there's a certain kind of closure to those beautiful moments we create in the classroom, when we have to end on this very simplistic exchange of what learning has meant. And perhaps another pessimistic thought before I move on to the more hopeful is one where I think, especially in very neoliberal versions of academia, I also start seeing that as long as it sells, it is being condoned, right? As long as there's a market for something, there are possibilities for it. And so when I came to the UK to study, I studied critical theory, whereas in the Netherlands, where I come from, that would have been very difficult because it was less market oriented at the time when I studied in the Netherlands. That doesn't mean that the UK is a more radical space, but in the UK, as long as you have enough fee-paying students for a degree in critical theory, you know, universities are happy. And I can see this happening also in relation to the decolonization of the university, that it becomes a marketable asset that universities start using in competition with each other for different students. And I think we see this development perhaps also, you know, following similar developments that Maria de Mar Pereira, who has of course spoken in one of your other sessions, has identified in relation to gender studies, where the neoliberalization of academia has provided gender studies, ironically, with certain opportunities, because as long as you get your citations, and as long as, again, that gives the university certain prestige, radical practices are accepted and even encouraged, not for its political content, but for its value. So that, I guess, leads us to being in very contradictory spaces, right? So I was introduced partially to approaches to critical pedagogy by Vanessa Andriotti when we both were at the University of Nottingham, and Sarah Motta and I also met at the University of Nottingham, which was a university that invested very heavily in having a campus in China and Malaysia, which was an incredibly lucrative way, again, to get international fees while keeping other students in their own countries and not having to let them into UK territory. In fact, those Chinese and Malaysian campuses of the University of Nottingham are exactly built according to the model, like the buildings are replicas of the University of Nottingham campus. So, you know, it's an incredible imperial project. Yet at the same time, we received funding to do this extremely radical outreach sessions, activist spaces. And so I think we have to all the time recognize those tensions and contradictions, really. And maybe then for me to end on that, I think before we move on to the next question, I'm really inspired still by Gayatri Spivak's idea of a constructive complicity or productive complicity. I mean, there is no outside a pure space that we can escape to. At least I doubt so with her. And she coins this idea in a very different context when she's reading Marx, Hegel, and Kant and things, that we need to engage with them, not just throw them away, but engage with them in a productively complicit way. And I think for me, that has been quite a helpful way to thinking about our position in neoliberal academia, trying to practice a radical politics. Rosalba, do you want to add something to it, or shall we move to the next question?
Perhaps we can move to the following question, Sarah.
Yeah, so our next question is about what possibilities pedagogical spaces in particular can offer, beyond what research, for instance, can offer. And again, I think Radhika also already referenced Hook's work. Of course, Bell Hooks made the point that the classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy. Radhika has also referred to the kind of co-learning with her students. And going back to our book, which I had not read for a while, I found it in a way strangely touching again when you haven't read something for a while, to read how we also start our own acknowledgements in the book by saying, first and foremost, we would like to express our gratitude to our students who so often remind us of the value of teaching in higher education, even under challenging or restrictive circumstances. Thanks for asking critical questions, for your patience when we get things wrong, for calling us out and for keeping us on our toes. To the Vietnamese student asking which war was meant when referring to the Vietnam War. The student challenging stereotypical representations of African women in canonical introductions to development studies. The student reminding all her peers that Haiti was the first anti-colonial revolution and Black Republic. The Mixteca mix indigenous student defining indigeneity not as an identity, but as a way of being and sense the world. We treasure the moments of collective insight in the classroom, as well as your gestures of appreciation. I think this encapsulates the spirit very much. It's also, I guess, a space in which we conduct a lot of our labor. I mean, I think, again, also this year has been incredibly challenging, I think, for everyone, students included. But I guess also a space that has been regenerative and restorative to a way, because even in online spaces, I think, they have also given us energy. And I think that's really important. For us, the starting point of the book was that we were really interested in the fact that both decolonial critics as well as feminist critics had highlighted how important pedagogy was. And in that sense, they pushed back against a more conventional mainstream academic hierarchy of knowledge in which research is seen as more important and more valued, more acknowledged than teaching. And teaching is the kind of side job. And of course, this is something that Bell Hooks recognizes, that Freire recognizes. And we thought that even though, of course, there are many tensions between decolonial thought and feminist thought, but also many convergences, one of the things that was very clear is that because they see the personal as political and they understand the connections between theory and activism, the classroom is one of the perfect sites to practice those connections. For me, I guess also, maybe before I hand over to Rosalba, I think what is inspiring about the classroom as a space is that if you have conversations there, you can show at a very early stage that another form of academia is possible, or that another form of the university is possible. And I mean by that you can demonstrate with the students, right, that different types of knowledge can be valued in academic spaces. You can demonstrate that different types of classroom practices, and I really like the idea of the transformative classroom rather than the safe classroom that Radhika raised in her presentation. I would like to respond to that later. I think the classroom is a space where we can show a different balance of representation also in the people that we read. And it is a space where we can talk about reflexivity and also the taking responsibility for our learning and for our positionality. So one of the things that I like doing in my Politics of Postcolonialism module is that I start very early on in the module. The second class is about colonial amnesia. And one of the points that we make in the lecture is that amnesia is not a passive act, right? But it's an active forgetting. And that means that when students, and that often happens, of course, when they come to this class, because the curriculum is so wide, you know, this is a third year module and some of them come to the class and they feel very ignorant. And I try to learn with them that this ignorance is not something that is individual, but that it is structural and that there's a reason why they would have this ignorance, and that it shouldn't lead to paralysis or to self-blame, but that it also should encourage them to take responsibility for working against that ignorance, right? And working against amnesia. And I think it has been really interesting in our conversations how this becomes a kind of framing for our learning together, the active working against amnesia. Yeah, so I think with that, I hand over to Rosalba.
I love that you ended with that, because something that in our preparation of this conversation, but also when we were working with the book, it was very clear for the three of us that and that not forgetting even our own journeys and as students from different countries outside the UK, let's put it in those terms, that nonetheless were forced to speak in English because that was the only language that I was able to understand in that moment. My Dutch was terrible. Was very important for us when we started to recognize how important, despite all the critiques that we have of our own journeys as students, how teaching and how the classroom was so relevant. Precisely because of the mistakes and the amnesias and the incapacity of our teachers to recognize how they were reproducing lots of violence, epistemic, racial violence. For us, a project that reflects on how many women across the world, how many feminists or women who work with women who struggle and are not feminists, how they were actually putting together strategies to counter this violence. But we also enter in this conversation thinking that the classroom was not only a space of transformation, but was a deeply violent space. And that we could learn from so many women across the globe that have been actually putting together strategies, just like you, Radhika. It was amazing what you were sharing with us. And that's why in this book, for example, we were very much concerned about bringing concrete examples for people to get inspiration. Not necessarily to replicate the whole thing, because we always were concerned about the specificity of the classroom where we were based. For example, my classrooms are mostly inhabited by students like me coming from the global south, or the majority of the world, let's put it in those terms, that nonetheless are elites in their own countries. The moment they can speak English, they are elites in their own countries. And these are people in transition, in the sense that once they put a foot in Europe, they discover themselves as the other. They are the racialized other. There is a lot of experience of students in my own teaching that come to express in their assignments, in their different contributions to the classroom, how they realize that they were not only from a specific African country, but that they are Black people, and how they are actually racialized the moment they put a feet in the Netherlands. So having this experience, the three of us coming from different genealogies of thinking, anti-colonial genealogies, but also post-colonial theory, and myself, decolonial theory, for us was very important to recenter ourselves into the classroom and pedagogies, but very much aware that it was, of course, a transformative space, as it can be a such violent space. And I think that somehow we have kept with this perspective in our interventions, in our conversations, knowing that we have to support each other in the different projects that we are developing in the different countries and universities in which we have been working. So this is the case that if, for example, there is an initiative that is addressing or touching upon the transformative possibilities of decolonization, then of course I run into Sarah or I run into Olivia to try to bring this critical edge. And this critical edge was that I was actually referring at the beginning, that we don't forget that those violence that we identified are colonial legacies, are imperial foundations of the institutions that we are inhabiting with our different positionalities, with our different, of course, and responsibilities at the same time, because we carry different responsibilities according to our concrete histories that precede us. But something that I was very much inspired of let's say, having this conversation with Sarah and also involving Olivia is the possibility of understanding that we are constructed by very different genealogies and experiences of the classroom, and that across these differences, we can create this coalition. And this coalition sometimes is very active, a book is out, but sometimes is not necessarily very active, but nonetheless, we know that they are there. We know that we are for each other. And we know that if we have, like, you know, there is this fantastic paper, what do you think about it? Or this initiative is coming, do you think that this is something that we can invest upon? And this is for me how feminist coalitional politics should look like, especially given the parameters of neoliberal academia. And this didn't, you know, it was not a project of a book. It actually, it's this, let's say, I would say hungry for understanding that we cannot do the work that we do in our different classrooms alone, that we cannot simply be confronting the violence of the institution, the wideness of the institution, without having each other, without knowing that in some cases it's important to be present in our lives as feminists, as anti-racist scholars, and also very critical about the, let's say, the neoliberalization and the casualization of the work that many of our colleagues are doing. So this is something that for me has been a very important factor of how I understand the classroom as not only the moment in front of the students, but it's a moment that is built upon these connections in the UK, back home. Now I'm home here in Mexico. I was also teaching online to a master mainly directed for indigenous students in one of the largest faculties of anthropology here in Mexico. And it was really interesting to perceive that some of the challenges of mental health, some of the challenges of isolation, some of the challenges of not really being able to, let's say, to connect what is happening in the classroom to the everyday of the pandemic, to the everyday of not having the possibility of accessing academia because you are a racialized person in Mexico, or because you are from a poor background, was extremely difficult to discuss in an online environment. And something that we have been investing a lot is into developing pedagogies that, yeah, in another conversation, I talk about them as pedagogies of relationality, in which actually what is happening outside, it's really shaping what is happening within the classroom. And this was something that brought us together. We had this very intense interest for transforming our classrooms, the way we read authors, the way we integrate authors into our curriculums. No, I wouldn't say canons, curriculums, in a way that transforms even the way we speak to our students and the way we work with each other. And I have a last point to say here before I go into the last question about the dangers of cooptation. Radhika, you mentioned something really important of how relevant is particularly under the conditions of a neoliberal university, and I would say an imperial and colonial institution like universities, to try to navigate with our students worlds and ways of thinking that are radically different from their own understanding of who they are and the world that's around them. But something that we have realized through the contribution of one of the authors in the book is that sometimes it's very important that our students, especially those that occupy positions of racial privilege or class privilege or physical body privilege, that they got lost in the incapacity of connecting to worlds that are radically different from them. What we have witnessed is the possibility of let's say, decenter the self, the I, the neoliberal subjectivity. And in this despair, of course, you'll never let them alone. You have to hold the space for them, as our friend Aminata Cairo says. You have to hold that space for that crumbling down of their worlds, of what they think they are. But it's very important that they experience this impossibility of translating to their own worlds these radically different worlds, which in somehow are already a process of transformation from them. And one of our contributors, Basa Aradayan, sorry for my pronunciation, she's actually inviting us as feminist teachers to think about the possibility of understanding that not everything that we are going to share with our students is going to be familiar, and that they have to be confronted with their unfamiliarity and the unintelligibility of so many words that they will never, ever be able to understand fully. This is, let's say, a lesson of humility, on humbling this neoliberal self-individual center I, which of course you cannot let them to do alone. You have to hold them and you have to create a space for them. But anyway, this is something that I wanted to connect with what you were saying. And going back very briefly to our last point, the risks and opportunities of associated with the popularization of the decolonial, which for me has been extremely painful, because after more than 30 years of scholarship in Latin America, mainly in Spanish, but coming from and in conversation with the First Nation movements and first originally people movements in Latin America and Afro-descendant people in Latin America, suddenly the decolonial becomes a trend. And it has been extremely painful, because while I was doing my PhD in the UK, this scholarship was absolutely dismissed as something completely irrelevant to think about, for example, international relations. That was my formative area in the 2000s in the UK. And I was forced to do something that I didn't want to do. That was to create a dissertation that was dialoguing in a critical way with Gramsci. And to this day, I say, well, it was okay, because now this is the way I teach. I always teach decolonial theory, decolonial scholarship in conversation with the big white dead men. But I'm also doing that in relation to the big white feminists. And this is a pedagogy and a way of working that now for me is very important. It's the way I teach decoloniality, because I'm interested in the dialogues. I'm interested on understanding where these genealogies of thinking the self as plural, as Maria Lugones has constantly reminded us, or going beyond the category of gender because of its imperial and colonial origin, to actually liberate us as plural selves, is something that for me is crucial. And it's very painful to see that this is not recognized or acknowledged. That when the universities are calling students, come, we're going to teach you what is decoloniality, it becomes just another perspective after what comes after the post-colonial. And many people confuse that decoloniality is deconstruction. And I'm like, oh my God, this is not. And honestly, in this moment in my life, I realized, well, not every critique should be decolonial. This is an orientation, it's an ethical orientation within the academia. For some, it's also a political imperative, and I truly respect that perspective as well, because come from anti-colonial Afro-descendant struggles in the Caribbean, especially in the Caribbean, and I fully respect that and support this struggle of my sisters in Dominican Republic and other countries in Spanish-speaking Latin America. But the way it has been translated into the Anglosphere and into the European academia is that anybody can do research that is decolonial if you use the three main authors, Dussel, Walter Mignolo, and I'm forgetting one. Anyway, the three big men. And don't take me wrong, I work with the three of them. I respect their scholarship, But then what happens with all the women that have been constantly not only criticizing the heteronormativity of some of the principles of decolonial thinking, like Maria Lugones, but many other scholars, decolonial feminist scholars, that have been criticizing, let's say, the epistemic and political foundations of white feminism, in conversation with Chicana feminism, in conversations and taking very seriously Black feminist critical race theory. These women are erased or appropriated, misrepresented, and that is extremely painful. Now, just to conclude that every time that that I'm called to give a conversation about decolonial feminism, I always have to say, not every critique is a decolonial critique. As decolonial feminists, we're not only concerned about epistemic violence, we're actually concerned about the silence behind that epistemic violence and what remains behind coloniality, that is erasure of the plurality of the worlds. And this is one of the tensions that we have with post-colonial feminism. For decolonial feminism, there is an outside. There is an outside, the capacity of, or the idea that modernity is a totality. It's something that we have never recognized as part of our genealogy, because our genealogy is very much informed by non-Western ways of understanding reality, being. But we understand that in order to be in a conversation that is productive in Europe, we need to understand our differences and try to create these coalitions. But anyway, I will take it there because I also wanted to liaise with the last thing that you say about this productive complicity. And we, for example, disagree with this, but this doesn't mean that we cannot have this conversation, especially when we are confronting this cooptation of the decolonial as the new flavor of the moment.
Yes, I think what I wanted to say speaks very much to the anger and the concern with erasure that Rosalba has just presented. I thought it was interesting that when a few years ago, when we made a special issue for the Dutch Journal of Gender Studies, one of our collaborators, Sophie Withaaks, an important Belgian scholar of color, she interviewed Philomena Asset, who is of course very famous for her work on everyday racism and also her subsequent work on race. She asked her what she thought of the decolonial, and she said in this interview that she worries about, and I quote, "If everything goes under the umbrella of decolonization, what may happen is that gender and sexuality is pushed aside and that men take over," repeating many earlier examples in which, and again I quote, "Black women start movements or take more risk than men to get the ball rolling, only to be pushed aside by men who are eager to be the spokesperson." And again, you know, that unfortunately really resonates. The reason for me why I proposed to Rosalba that we included a conversation around this question was another point which made me really, really angry. I saw that in the UK, a particular very mainstream scholar who had never engaged with decolonial thought at all, and who is not even quoting the big three, he doesn't even bother about that. He wrote a piece about decolonizing the British Army. And I was just floored by that claim, you know. I mean, like, where do we even start? I mean, I think, I mean, there are things that cannot be redeemed, right? I think that is also really important about decolonial critique, that not everything is redeemable. It's not a reformist critique. You cannot simply decolonize the British Army. Like I said, I don't even know where to start, and I just can't believe that get published as the editor's choice in a very prominent international relations journal. And I think, yeah, I mean, in my anger and frustration, I'm trying to write a collaborative piece with some people as a response, trying to not give it too much space, but at the same time not letting it stand, which is always a very difficult balance to strike. I similarly have been thinking, I mean, very similar to what Rosalba was saying first about the dangers of the dilution of the term decolonial, because of the fact that it gets completely separated from the scholarship and activism that underpins it. I see so many practices also within my own university, to be very honest, you know, where people are in a sense also not doing their homework. I mean, you know, they will come to sessions to decolonize this or that, and they believe everything can be decolonized, but there's no sense that this word has moorings. You know, it comes from somewhere, like Rosalba was saying, and it comes from labor, as she has been saying, that is in danger of not at all being recognized, and in fact in danger of being erased. And maybe to come back to points here, I mean, I think again, this has been prefigured already in some early work, right, by Tak and Yang, who have the famous article, "Decolonization is not a metaphor," I think, which is really important. And maybe as a kind of nice link back to where Radhika started before we open the discussion, you know, Kathy Davis wrote an important article, "Intersectionality as a Buzzword," right, where she was similarly worried about how intersectionality very quickly became a buzzword, something that you all had to do without needing to properly engage with what it would actually entail. And we might see a repetition of this history of what has happened with intersectionality and the struggles we have about linking this back and connecting this back to the Black scholarship this comes from with the decolonial right now. But I'm conscious of time. I think we should move to questions and responses.
Such a rich discussion, really. And I was actually rereading your introduction last evening, and I felt like I was already in, like, there were so many resonances that I was already in dialogue, in a generous and generative dialogue with you all, even before we started this conversation. If one can imagine being in conversations like that. I do that all the time. When I'm reading other feminist scholars, I feel like I'm already in conversation with them, even though they have no idea that I'm doing that. So thank you so much for the rich insights that you shared. There were a couple of things that really, you know, there are so many resonances in terms of the classroom space as a space of radical learning, and where we can really kind of inspire our students to do things differently, and also equally be inspired by them to co-create you know, alternative spaces, as you were talking about, both of you, Sarah and Rosalba. I think and other resonances as well in terms of obviously how decolonization has really been appropriated and co-opted by neoliberal forces, but also actually beyond that, I would say. And so resonance is there. But two things that I wanted to kind of pick up on. One was, which led me to think through a little more carefully about the idea of the classroom as not only a transformative space, but also a space of violence. I've always seen the classroom as a space of, you know, it can be a space of exclusion. You're absolutely right in terms of violence. And one incident that was coming to my mind, was coming to sort of to the surface in my mind constantly when you were speaking, Rosalba, is of how classrooms in Indian university context can be a space of violence. Especially that there was recently an incident where an upper caste, middle class Hindu teacher was called out for the ways in which they were performing violence towards Dalit students, so students from the so-called untouchable community, lower caste, and that really kind of struck me. And I was thinking also about the work of Sharmila Rege, a Dalit feminist standpoint scholar. She's no more, but the amazing work that she has done with respect to writing about Dalit feminism, but also the ways in which she brings in Dalit feminism in the context of the classroom space, and thinking about how and kind of making connections with, for instance, you know, and making sort of thinking along with the work of bell hooks and others in terms of how that space can be, so what do we do with the space which is of exclusion, but which is also, can also be a space of violence. So I mean, there was some, you know, there was some thoughts that your, that particular insight provoked in my mind. And the second thing was, you were talking about, and this is something that Sarah, you mentioned with respect to this idea of constructive complicity or productive complicity that Spivak talks about, and with respect to neoliberalism, that it can, and it reminded me of a chapter in the edited volume, in the volume that Fiona Mackay, Krishna Menon, and Rukmini Sen and I worked on, and which came out last year, at the end of last year, November, about called Doing Feminisms in the Academy, where, and in their chapter they engage in so it's a conversational piece, and they also reflect on what are the ways in which they ask, how do we put our oppositional knowledge as feminists to use, to seek to transform the institutions of the university? Is that even possible? And they also question, or rather they caution that blanket labels like the neoliberal academy may speak a truth at a macro level, but they fail to capture the nuance and sort of those soft spots and spaces, the in-between spaces that can present themselves as opportunities for doing the kind of work that we want to do as feminists in the academy. And so there can be, it also creates those contradictions. So, you know, what you were saying, Sarah, about, okay, so as long as they're fee paying, you can teach the stuff as long as it will generate fees. The university will be open to those ideas. In fact, if I think a little bit more about it, even our project, which called Teaching Feminism, Transforming Lives, the collaboration between this North-South collaboration between AUD and Edinburgh. So I started my career at AUD. I am now at Edinburgh, and I mean, selfishly for me, it was the idea of, you know, these are amazing feminists who I work with now and I worked with before, and how can I bring my two worlds together? But, you know, it is really, you know, in a neoliberal context where you have to apply for grants and you have to do project, you have to write proposals and, you do this stuff. It is one of those instances which enabled us to bring together 3 generations of feminists in the academy, and to have those kind of conversations, to have those kind of reflections, which otherwise would happen only sort of in the, in the corridors of outside a staff meeting or a conference, if we had to meet between the North and the South. Or those water cooler moments, which then can turn into something like where we come together multiple times. It's established academics, it's early career academics, and bringing that sort of passion across generations. So sort of that kind of feminist mentoring to take place. I think that is also something that so those contradictions do very much exist in terms of working in an academy where in neoliberal times, I'd say.
Thank you so much, Radhika, for your answer, and I'm really inspired by your the radical classroom that all of you have mentioned, and I think that it's a really important idea. So to think about how to get off with these power relationships in the classrooms, and so we have one question that goes toward this subject. So I'll put it in the chat too, and I'll read it to you. The question is, what are the ways in which, as decolonial feminist professors, one can ensure an anti-racist classroom environment that will enable students of color to productively learn, especially in Europe, where most white classrooms are the norm, and yet Black and students of color are the ones calling for anti-racist structural change. So maybe Rosalba, Sarah, do you have an idea for this really concrete question?
I'm one of the, I don't know, few, you correct me, that most of the students I teach in Europe are people like me, are people coming from the global south. So this means that I teach very few students from the Netherlands and European students. So they are the minority in my classrooms. This has been extremely important for not only their transitioning away from their, let's say, normative position in relation to the so-called others. I have seen many people flourishing into amazing anti-racist activists, for example, in the Netherlands or in other countries in Europe. And at the same time, what I have witnessed that works very well is that as we are not English speakers, native English speakers, something that creates in my classrooms the possibility of students who are for the first time confronted with this language is the understanding that we are all struggling with it, and that we are all somehow choosing, but at the same time forced to communicate with a language that we don't really master, that we are confronted with the experience at the same time of learning from not being able to be properly articulated. And in every single session in my classroom, I do this exercise of reflecting of how there are so many things that we cannot say to each other. Not only the minority of white European students, but also students coming from the global south. There are so many things that we can share or would like to share, but we are unable to. And this incapacity of communicating and reaching and fully travel to the world of each other, for us has been one way in which those who need, let's say, a classroom that affirm their humanity, when they are realizing that they are othered, has been very important. And for those who are learning to let go their who they were, has also been a caring possibility that is not destructive or that alienate them from the rest of the classroom. So far, this is what I can think.
Yeah, it's a very important and very challenging question. And of course, I'm also speaking as a white professor here, in a very white department at the University of York. So I guess one of the things for me in my classroom is also the challenge of creating a relationship of trust with racialized students in my classroom, which, undoubtedly is a challenge because, of course, that relates to my individual performance, but also to the structural performance of academia. I think there are a few mechanisms that I use and try to use. One of the things that happens in my third year module of Politics of Postcolonialism, which is an elective module, is that even though the University of York is a very white university, that particular module has quite a different composition because it's an elective module and certain students self-select into that module. And I think already also for the white students to be confronted with the fact that suddenly their classroom looks quite different from other modules that they have taken is a very interesting learning experience where, because the balance is a different one, they become conscious of what has preceded, in other modules. I think as a facilitator of the conversation, I try to think about, and this is of course even more difficult sometimes in virtual spaces, but who is speaking first on topics. And we know that there are mechanisms by which, if we make sure that certain people can speak first, that often changes again the balance in the classroom and allows others to speak who might otherwise not be seen as the dominant voices. I think as a very concrete mechanism, try to reflect this in my syllabus, but also in any images of scholars that I show on my PowerPoint slide. So if I have visible images of intellectuals, I do really try to make sure that women of color are represented as experts. And again, that is a quite different practice from some other modules, but I'm hoping that that practice mirrors then also what would be the dynamics in the classroom. But of course, it is always imperfect and in process.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Radhika, would you also like to answer to this question?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Great.
It might also give me an opportunity to talk a little bit about privilege walk, which I'd mentioned, but I didn't get a chance to elaborate. Actually, a couple of things. One is that at Edinburgh, in the experience that I've had is that at the undergraduate level, the feminist classrooms that I am part of are still very white. Whereas at the postgraduate level, the dynamic is quite different because it's, so let me qualify that. At the undergraduate level, we do have students from who are from outside the UK, but they're often students from the US or from Western Europe, and there will be a few from East Asian countries. But it's still predominantly a white classroom. Whereas at the postgraduate level, it's quite different. The dynamic is quite different because there's so many more international students. So, in a sense, it is more like what you were talking about, minus the English language, as an issue, as a concern. My struggle is different in these different classrooms. At the undergraduate, advanced undergraduate level, the courses on which I teach, I realized very quickly that I can't kind of, we talk so much about research-led teaching, but I can't talk to them about what I really research, which is feminist movements in India, and talk about past, the intersections of past, class and gender, without it sort of becoming, oh, that happens only out there in the global south kind of a thing. So how do I make that relatable to my students? And how do I kind of create that space? So in response to the question that was asked, where the students are reflecting on their positionality, where they are really being reflexive about not just their positionality, but also the learning strategies that they come with into the classroom. And how do we do some of that unlearning together? And so I can't talk about marginality. I can't center marginality because the danger is that it will be taken as, oh, it happens in the global south, or it's not really our story. Because this is an elite university. So these are also quite privileged students whom we have in our classroom space. So I have to talk about privilege and interrogating our privilege, and how privilege is not static and neither is marginality. So, and that's how I do the privilege walk activity in the classroom. I don't do it with our own our real world identities in the way that happens in some of the American US classrooms that I'm familiar with. I do that with identity cards, but also because I don't want to put anybody in a spot and compel them to out themselves in ways that they won't be comfortable. It's that, and B, also there isn't that much diversity, which is why I'm actually doing the activity in a sense. And so that's one of the things that we do, but it also kind of sets the tone early on in terms of, how we have to constantly be reflective in the classroom space, but also interrogate our learning strategies that we bring with us. Another thing is also, and there again, and at the postgraduate level, I think it's also about the point that I had made earlier about being cautious not to turn the students from the global south into case studies and put them in a spot. So how to kind of navigate that? It can be tricky to do that. And for some of the students who've not had that kind of exposure to talk about students from the global south or about the global south context that they are coming from, that these students have no familiarity with, but there are other students who are from those contexts in ways that are really quite problematic and can feel extremely disempowering and can make one feel really angry. And I feel like, and so, there have been sort of instances where, for instance, even in my undergraduate classroom, where, there would be, and which connects with Data Narayan Swami's point about right wing and, how do we kind of challenge those ideas? Well, there'll be students who will say stuff like unemployment is rising here because people are taking away our, people from outside, these migrants are taking away our jobs. How do you, I've been in situations where in a classroom where I'm the student and where these kind of comments are let to slide. But that's really problematic. That is not the few students of color or who are from the global south will feel that their dignity, their sort of sense of identity doesn't have the same value. So it needs to be questioned, it needs to be challenged, but how do we do it in a way that is a teachable moment, and yet it's not putting the blame on a single individual? And you know, that kind of connects, Sarah, with the point that you were making about ignorance, in a sense, that it's not individual, it's actually structural. So to kind of locate that learning, so we have to hold the space, not only for the student, and to create the space, not only for the few students who are of color from the global south in a predominantly white classroom, or even in a classroom where there is diversity, but it is the same few local, and I use that in quotes, local students who will speak, who will get more talk time, and still also hold the space for that unlearning to happen with those students, who are actually sort of dominating the talk time. How to kind of, you know, work on that in a way that they can, that they begin to do that questioning and that important work of disrupting whiteness in the classroom space, disrupting the white privilege in the classroom space. So those are some of the ways that I kind of do that. One is, of course, the teachable moments and kind of calling out, but in a way that is not experienced as a blame game. And the other is the privilege walk activity, amongst others.
So touched by what you were saying, Radhika, and I really think that I would love to continue this conversation, because in my case I have another layer of complexity, and it's the complexity that the let's say the racial diversity that I can see in my classrooms is not necessarily there in terms of where the students are coming from intellectually, or where their labor or job employment experiences. So I have a classroom in which some students elect to come to my classroom, from European descent, because they are interested in decolonization, decoloniality, and they are the ones who are pushing the agenda of decolonization, where I have students coming from the global south who are very much concerned about this idea of renouncing to their privileges, because they are the elites in the countries. But not only that, both of them are educated, as you have already mentioned in your presentation, with the same authors. We read the same people. We read the same dead white authors when we are dealing with politics. All of them know the same guys. And therefore, their terms of reference, the epistemic diversity that we would like to find in a classroom, at least in my experience, I need to build it up from scratch sometimes, from nowhere, from confronting them with their philosophers from the regions that they have never, ever been read, because as part of the imperial colonization of their minds, as former colonial subjects, of course, they were never reading their authors, or they read it in a very specific light. So even in demographically diverse classrooms, in bachelor's or in postgraduate degree, you have, at least in my experience in the Netherlands, the same mentality. And this is the mentality of this idea that their own thinkers or elders are not really thinkers to be taken into consideration. So yeah, I needed to jump with that. That is the other complexity that, at least in my classroom, I had to deal with, and it's not easy.